shadow moved, then vanished before it could be caught. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Comment where you're listening from. I always look forward to it. Let's begin. There was, on the surface of it, nothing in the least sinister about the Wren Hollow summer improvement fete. Indeed, had anyone been asked at 2:30 that afternoon whether the village could possibly furnish the material for tragedy, he would almost certainly have laughed. Wren Hollow, lying in one of those folds of the English countryside which seem designed expressly for the cultivation of roses, gossip, and respectable habits, was not the sort of place in which one expected murder. It possessed a flint church with a square Norman tower, a duck pond with too many ducks and too little water, a post office of surprising authority, and a green on which every public virtue was annually displayed beneath bunting. The fate itself had been discussed for weeks in tones of mild urgency. There was to be a white elephant stall, a raffle, a Victoria sponge competition, a string quartet from Much Benham, if they could be induced to arrive on time, and, as Mrs. Lionel Prendergast said more than once, a perfectly delightful historical tableau involving local children dressed as figures from village history. Since Wren Hollow had never, to anyone's knowledge, done anything historically significant, this last feature had depended rather heavily on invention. By 3 o'clock, the green wore the festive, faintly over-organized appearance common to English charity events. Striped awnings fluttered. Trestle tables groaned beneath jams, embroidered cushion covers, and an unwanted silver-plated toast racks. Ladies in floral frocks and hats, suitable to Ascot, but several years out of date, moved briskly about with cash boxes, lists, and expressions of cheerful martyrdom. Men who would have shuddered at labor in any other setting drove tent pegs into the earth with an energy that suggested both community spirit and private irritation. Children ran in widening spirals. Dogs barked at strings of bunting as though affronted by them. The brass urn for tea hissed ominously. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a canvas chair near the tea tent, observed it all with the air of a person entirely occupied by knitting and therefore beneath notice. She had come from St. Mary Mead only 2 days before to stay with her niece's old school friend, Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, whose cottage stood just beyond the green. And Miss Marple had not intended to do anything more strenuous than sit in the sun and be agreeable. But village life, she often reflected, had a way of bringing one more material than one sought. She wore a pale grey dress, very clean and very old, and had a basket at her feet. Her knitting needles clicked steadily. She looked at no one in particular, yet she missed very little. "Quite the event, isn't it?" said Mrs. Harrow, dropping into the chair beside her with the breathless collapse of a woman who had spent the entire morning being useful. "Though I do think the bunting near the vicarage side is dreadfully uneven, and Mr. Phipps has put the coconut shy far too close to the cakes. One of those dreadful boys will have a go and smash the Battenberg." Miss Marple smiled. "It is always the details," she said gently. That upset the smooth progress of things." Mrs. Harrow laughed, though she had not really listened. Like many energetic women, she had acquired the useful habit of speaking while mentally attending elsewhere. "You must tell me, dear Miss Marple, what you think of everyone. You always know exactly what people are like." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Not exactly, but one does notice little similarities." Mrs. Harrow did not ask what those similarities might be. Her eye had fallen upon Mrs. Prendergast, who was crossing the grass with the air of a field marshal encountering inferior troops. Mrs. Lionel Prendergast had, for the past 19 years, presided over village occasions with an authority only slightly undermined by the fact that her husband, Lionel, had once attempted to abscond to Bognor with a widow who sold ornamental fish. Though she was tall, handsome in a firm-jawed way, and wore mauve silk with a hat much too youthful for her. Her smile, when she bestowed it, never quite reached the eyes. "My dear Elspeth," she said crisply, "there you are. The flower arranging certificates are nowhere to be found, and Mrs. Cleeve insists she gave them to you." Mrs. Harrow sprang up at once. "I'm certain I put them in the vestry room." "You are certain of a great many things," said Mrs. Prendergast. "Whether any of them correspond to reality is another matter." She turned, then noticed Miss Marple and altered her expression to one of social brightness. "How nice," she said, "to see visitors taking an interest in village life. We do our best, of course, though standards are not always what one would wish." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am sure it is all most delightful." Mrs. Prendergast moved away, though not before allowing her glance to rest, fleetingly but distinctly, on the silver cups displayed at the horticultural table. There were 3 of them, tarnished despite polishing, and one rather larger than the others. That larger cup, presented yearly for the best private rose cultivation, was the pride of Wren Hollow. It had been won 6 times by Colonel Arthur Bryce of Hollow End. "Poor Colonel Bryce will be unbearable if he wins again," Mrs. Harrow murmured as she hurried after Mrs. Prendergast. "Though I suppose one must let old soldiers have their roses." Left alone, Miss Marple continued knitting and looked toward the horticultural table. Colonel Bryce stood there at that moment, broad-shouldered despite his age, but with the square red face of a man formed by empire, discipline, and reliable breakfasts. He wore a dark suit too warm for the weather, and held his stick not as support, but as punctuation. Beside him hovered his daughter, Miss Lydia Bryce, a slender, dark-haired woman of perhaps 35, whose composure seemed less natural than carefully acquired. She had a quiet face, but her eyes moved quickly. There was something about Lydia Bryce that suggested a person perpetually braced. Opposite them stood Mr. Felix Dane. If Wren Hollow had possessed more imagination, it might have distrusted Felix Dane on sight. He was not, in fact, a theatrical person, but he had that polished urban neatness which is enough in itself to make a village uneasy. He had come down from London 6 months earlier and taken the old Dean Lodge on a temporary lease, she declaring himself in need of peace and country air. Since then he had been civil to everyone, subscribed to local causes, and contrived, without obvious effort, to become the subject of much speculation. He was perhaps 40, very well dressed in a linen suit, with fair hair beginning to recede and a pleasant voice which seemed always on the edge of amusement. Some said he was in finance. Others believed he wrote. Mrs. Phipps, who had a genius for unsupported certainty, declared he had been mixed up in films. No one knew. This, in itself, was enough to keep conversation supplied for months. At present, he was speaking to Lydia Bryce with an ease that the Colonel plainly disliked. "I assure you," Felix was saying, "your roses deserve the cup, Colonel. They look positively military, disciplined, upright, not a petal out of place." Colonel Bryce grunted. "Roses are improved by order, sir, like most things." Felix smiled. Lydia glanced down. "You mustn't tease Papa," she said lightly. "Tease?" The Colonel's brows rose. "I am not a man to be teased, Lydia." "No," said Lydia at once, too quickly. "No, of course not." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. A remark, a correction, an instant submission. Such tiny domestic things often said more than quite dramatic scenes. There were husbands and fathers, she had long thought, who ruled a household less by temper than by the long practice of being obeyed. A shadow fell across her. Lovely day for it. The speaker was Dr. Julian Fane, the village physician, carrying a cup of tea and looking as though he had forgotten to drink it. He was a lean, fair man in his early 40s, and agreeable and tired-looking, with the air of one permanently interrupted. There was intelligence in his face, but also strain. His coat was carelessly brushed, and his tie sat slightly awry, as if straightening it had ceased to seem worth the effort. "Yes," said Miss Marple, though perhaps a little warm for some of the older gentlemen. Dr. Fane followed her glance. "Bryce?" He'd rather die than admit to discomfort. "That is often said," murmured Miss Marple. Dr. Fane laughed. "Oh, not literally, I hope." He set down the untouched tea on the grass beside her chair. "You're Mrs. Harrow's guest, aren't you? Miss Marple?" "Yes. She warned me you were observant. That's a dangerous reputation in a village." "Much more dangerous," said Miss Marple, "to deserve one." He looked amused, then momentarily distracted, for across the green a young woman in a blue dress had emerged from the bookstall and was making her way toward the church path. She moved quickly, as though unwilling to be detained. She was pretty in a pale, uncertain way, with fair hair escaping under a straw hat and the expression of someone listening inwardly to troubling thoughts. Miss Marple had already been told that this was Miss Clara Weston, niece to the late Solicitor Weston and now companion secretary to old Mrs. Dalrymple at the Manor House. She had also been told in lower tones and with a more savoury interest that Clara had lately broken an understanding with Mr. Peter Cleeve, the schoolmaster. Peter Cleeve himself stood near the raffle stall, very upright and rather grim, selling tickets to persons who did not wish to buy them. He was a handsome young man, though there was an intensity in his face which would have suited tragedy better than arithmetic. His gaze followed Clara Weston with open unhappiness. Dr. Fane had followed it too. "Poor devil," he said. "Which one?" asked Miss Marple. The doctor glanced at her and smiled ruefully. "That is exactly the right question." Before she could answer, a loud clatter arose from the direction of the White Elephant stall, followed by a shriek of indignation from Mrs. Phipps. Two boys had overturned a basket of cracked china while attempting to fence with parasol handles. Volunteers converged. The boys scattered. A spaniel seized a pincushion and was pursued by three ladies in espadrilles. Miss Marple resumed knitting. The village, she reflected, always appeared most innocent at the precise moment before it became dangerous. There were, and among the inhabitants of Wren Hollow, certain quiet tensions which no fate committee, however diligent, could wholly smooth over. The manor house, for instance, had long been occupied by Mrs. Eugenia Dalrymple, a wealthy widow who was spoken of with equal parts respect, envy, and indignation. Mrs. Dalrymple was 72, immensely rich, and believed by all parties to be on the brink of altering her will. Whether this belief sprang from fact or wishfulness scarcely mattered. It influenced behavior all the same. Mrs. Dalrymple herself had not yet appeared on the green, but expectation of her arrival lent a faint, dramatic charge to the atmosphere. She was to open the new village reading room at 4 o'clock precisely and present the horticultural prizes immediately thereafter. In the meanwhile, people watched the lane, and among those who watched most closely was Mr. Ambrose Tilling, the solicitor newly installed in the office formerly occupied by Clara Weston's uncle. Tilling was a thin, careful man with sandy hair and a habit of speaking as if every sentence might later be read aloud in court. He stood with one hand inside his jacket and the other resting on a rolled program, as though prepared both for rain and legal complication. Beside him was Mrs. Vera Phipps, who ran the post office and considered information a public trust. Mrs. Phipps had a broad face, sharp blue eyes, and a voice that carried. Her moral standards were impeccable for other people. "I always say," she informed Tilling, "money changes everything. Not that Mrs. Dalrymple has changed. She was difficult before she was widowed. But it does attract a certain sort." Her gaze slid meaningfully toward Felix Dane. Tilling compressed his lips. "Mr. Dane seems perfectly respectable." "That," said Mrs. Phipps darkly, "is what is so unsettling." Not far away, Felix Dane was speaking now with Clara Weston. He had intercepted her by the church gate. From where she sat, Miss Marple could not hear their words, but she saw enough to note the pattern. Clara anxious and resistant, Felix low-voiced and smiling, not pressing, but not relinquishing the conversation either. Then Peter Cleeve came up abruptly, hatless and flushed. Clara started. Felix turned his head. He did not move away, but stood almost lazily, as though curious what would happen. There was a brief exchange. Peter's face darkened. Clara said something sharply. Felix raised his brows with an expression of polite surprise. Then Clara broke off and walked away alone, leaving the two men facing each other. Peter Cleeve spoke with visible heat. Felix answered very quietly. That, Miss Marple thought, was often the more dangerous sort. Dr. Fane, who had also noticed the little scene, muttered, "This is exactly what village life does. Puts every private misery on a green and sells tea beside it." Miss Marple looked at him. "You have lived here long?" 5 years. "And do you like it?" He hesitated, which was answer enough. Before he could speak, a bell rang sharply from the church porch, the signal that the children's historical tableau was to begin. Chairs scraped. People drifted toward the platform erected against the lich gate. Mrs. Prendergast's voice was heard commanding somebody named Edith not to droop. The quartet from Much Benham, having arrived at last, soared uncertainly at the opening bars of something intended to be pastoral. Miss Marple rose with some deliberation. Dr. Fane offered his arm, and she accepted it. "My dear doctor," she said, "one should never underestimate the instructive value of an amateur performance." He laughed. "You expect disaster?" "Only confusion," said Miss Marple. "But confusion is often very revealing." The tableau was exactly the kind of thing one would expect when a village attempts history with 6 children, 3 curtains, and insufficient rehearsal. First came a Roman centurion, represented by the butcher's son in a tea-tray breastplate. Then a Saxon milkmaid whose costume suggested Little Bo Peep after a misunderstanding. And then a Norman knight who lost his helmet and kicked it angrily into the front row. The audience was indulgent. Laughter spread in warm, harmless waves. Even Colonel Bryce smiled, briefly and as if surprised by his own indulgence. Miss Marple, seated now in the second row beside Mrs. Harrow, observed not the stage, but the faces beyond it. Lydia Bryce was not watching the children. Her attention kept straying to the lane. Felix Dane stood a little apart from the crowd, hands in pockets, apparently relaxed. But now and then he glanced toward the same place. Peter Cleeve had stationed himself under an elm, too far away to be sociable, and was tearing a program into neat strips. Clara Weston was nowhere visible. "Where has that girl got to?" Mrs. Harrow whispered. "She was to help Mrs. Dalrymple from the car." "Perhaps she has been delayed," said Miss Marple. "That child is all nerves. Quite pretty, though. Men are always a nuisance to pretty girls, especially when there's money nearby." Miss Marple made a small, absent sound. The lane to the manor house curved behind a bank of hawthorn and could not be seen from the green. Yet the expectation of arrival had increased. Several heads turned whenever a motor was heard in the distance. At last it came, the low purr of an approaching car. The quartet faltered. Mrs. Prendergast, who had stepped forward to introduce Queen Elizabeth I in the person of little Mabel Fortescue, broke off in mid-sentence. The audience stirred and half-turned. A dark green motor rolled into view beyond the hedge and came slowly down the lane toward the green. "That will be Mrs. Dalrymple," murmured Mrs. Harrow. But it was not. The car was Mrs. Dalrymple's, certainly, the old daimler known to every villager, but at the wheel sat not Clara Weston or the regular chauffeur who had gone down with influenza, but a young gardener from the manor. Beside him was the parlour-maid, white-faced and crying openly. The car stopped awkwardly. The gardener scrambled out. For one suspended second, no one understood. The fete, with its bunting and paper rosettes, seemed to hold its breath. Then the girl said, in a voice shrill with shock, "Mrs. Dalrymple's gone." The words fell absurdly, almost meaninglessly, into the warm afternoon. Mrs. Prendergast stared. "Gone?" The parlour-maid clutched the side of the car. She was in the morning room. Miss Weston told cook she was resting before coming out. But when I took in her shawl, she weren't there, and the French window was open, and Miss Weston can't be found neither. The green erupted. Questions flew from every direction. Where had they looked? When had she last been seen? Was she ill? Had she gone walking? Was Clara with her? Had there been an accident? Mrs. Phipps declared at once that something dreadful had happened. Mr. Tilling said sharply that no one knew anything of the kind. Children began to cry because adults had stopped pretending. Miss Marple remained still. Not because she understood, but because she knew too well the uselessness of movement in those first moments when panic turns everyone into a blur. Colonel Bryce had risen to his feet. His face, so red a moment before, had gone an ugly brick color. "What nonsense is this?" he barked. Gone where?" The parlor maid shook her head wildly. "I don't know, Colonel. Only her hat was there, and the room all upset like, and Miss Weston's handbag on the floor." Peter Cleeve took a step forward. "Clara's handbag?" "Yes, sir." Peter's expression changed in an instant from anger to naked alarm. Felix Dane moved then, but not toward the car. Instead he turned slightly, scanning the edge of the green, the churchyard gate, the lane. Calculating, Miss Marple thought. It was very quick, and he corrected it immediately. Yet she had seen it. Dr. Fane was already at the parlour-maid's side. "Steady now. Tell me exactly. Was there any sign of blood?" The girl made a choking sound. "No, sir. Only the curtains all blowing and a vase broken and—" "And what?" said Dr. Fane. She shut her eyes. "And Mrs. Dalrymple's brooch, the diamond one. It were on the carpet with the pin bent back." A murmur ran through the crowd. Bent pin, open window, missing woman, missing companion. It was astonishing how rapidly people can pass from confusion to theory when supplied with only 2 or 3 suggestive facts. Mrs. Phipps gasped audibly. Mr. Tilling said, "This must be reported at once." Mrs. Prendergast began issuing instructions to no one in particular. The gardener repeated that they had searched the shrubbery, the terrace, the rose walk, the old kitchen garden. There was no sign, no note, no word. "No police yet?" asked Dr. Fane. The gardener swallowed. "Cook said fetch the doctor and Mr. Tilling first, sir, because of the fete and all the people." "Quite right," said Tilling, though he looked as though he hated the responsibility. "I'll telephone," Peter Cleeve said hoarsely. I'm going to the manor." He strode off at once, almost running. No one tried to stop him. For an instant, Lydia Bryce looked after him with a curious expression, not sympathy exactly, nor surprise, but something more guarded. Then she became aware of Felix Dane near her shoulder, and visibly started. "You had better sit down, Miss Bryce," he said in his smooth voice. "I am perfectly well." "Of course." Colonel Bryce struck his stick on the grass. "This is absurd. Women do not simply vanish from their drawing rooms." "No," said Miss Marple quietly to herself. "Not often." Mrs. Harrow turned. "Did you say something?" Miss Marple rose. "I think," she said, "that perhaps I should like a little walk." "A walk, my dear Miss Marple, at a moment like this?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. Her mild blue eyes had sharpened a trifle. "At a moment like this, one sometimes sees something before it has been thoroughly walked over." And because she was old, unimportant, and had spoken in the most harmless tone imaginable, no one thought to stop her as she moved away from the crowd, across the edge of the green, and toward the narrow footpath that ran between the churchyard wall and the hawthorn hedge to the manor lane. Halfway down it, she paused. On the dusty margin of the path, partly sheltered by nettles, lay a scrap of pale blue ribbon. It might have come from a child's hat. It might have blown from a stall. It might have meant nothing at all. Miss Marple bent, picked it up, and turned it over between finger and thumb. The ribbon was not new. One end had been torn, not cut. Near the tear there clung a tiny dark stain. She looked up. Ahead, beyond the bend in the path, and the hedge cast a long, narrow shadow across the lane. It trembled in the slight breeze as though someone had very recently passed through the gap where the branches had been forced apart. Miss Marple stood very still. There are moments before facts have arranged themselves into anything intelligible, when instinct is merely the recognition of a pattern too faint to name. She had felt it before, in parlors, in train compartments, in respectable houses with antimacassars. Something had happened at the manor house, something that involved fear, haste, and at least one person who wished not to be observed. And quite suddenly, from somewhere beyond the hedge, there came the sound of a woman crying out. It was not a scream. It was shorter, more stifled than that, as though fear had been met by a hand or by surprise. Then silence. Here Miss Marple folded the ribbon into her palm and began, with remarkable speed for a lady of her years, to make her way toward the gap in the hedge. The branches caught at her sleeve as she went through, and for a moment the hedge seemed absurdly solid, as though nature itself had taken sides with concealment. Then Miss Marple emerged into the manor lane and saw that the cry had come, not from the house, but from the strip of rough ground beyond the old brick wall where the lane widened before the gates. Clara Weston was standing there with both hands pressed to her throat. She looked, in that first instant, less like a woman who had discovered something than like a woman discovered by it. Her straw hat was gone. Her fair hair had come loose about her face, and there was a tear across one sleeve of her blue dress. At her feet, half hidden in the long grass by the ditch, lay Mrs. Dalrymple's ivory-handled cane. Miss Marple took it all in before Clara turned and saw her. "Oh!" Clara gave a broken sort of gasp. Oh, thank heaven!" She swayed, and Miss Marple, though slight herself, had a deft way of supporting people at the exact angle they required. She led the younger woman to the low stretch of wall and settled her there. "You have had a shock," she said. "Breathe a little, my dear. Only slowly." Clara obeyed with difficulty. Her eyes were enormous. I thought it was she. I thought she was there." "In the ditch?" Clara nodded and shut her eyes. "I saw something pale under the grass, but it was only the cane. I knew it at once afterward, of course, but for a moment Her voice failed. Miss Marple picked up the cane, the silver band engraved E.D. She was scratched, and one side of the ivory handle bore a faint smear of earth. "You came this way from the house?" "Yes." "Alone?" Clara hesitated. That tiny pause, Miss Marple reflected, had in it all the discouragement of modern life. Young women had once been taught to lie boldly and consistently, but now they seemed to want both concealment and moral approval. "Yes," said Clara at last. "That is, yes, when I came out here." "When you came out here," repeated Miss Marple softly. "Not necessarily when you left the house." Clara stared at her. Then, all at once, the strain in her face changed. Fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Relief, perhaps, at finding someone too old to alarm and too intelligent to be deceived by the first foolish story that presented itself. "You are Miss Marple," she said. "Mrs. Harrow told me. She said you notice things." "People are very kind," said Miss Marple. "What happened?" Clara twisted her hands together. "I don't know where to begin." "That is always the difficulty with the truth," said Miss Marple. "It has so many unnecessary parts. Begin with what you last saw." Clara swallowed. "I was with Mrs. Dalrymple in the morning room just after 3:30. She was quite herself. Cross, but quite herself. She had changed her mind twice about the fete and once about the reading room speech, and she was angry because the emerald silk shawl had not been aired properly. I went to fetch another from upstairs. That cannot have taken more than 3 or 4 minutes. And when you returned, the room was empty. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her face. The French window was open. Yes. The broken vase. Clara nodded. By the writing desk. It had been on the little round table near the window. The rug was pushed back. My handbag was on the floor because I had put it down by the chair. At first I thought she must have gone onto the terrace in a temper, but she wasn't there. And then? I called her name. I looked in the morning room passage, the library, the little withdrawing room, even upstairs again. Then Cook came out, and we searched together. Then everyone was searching. Oh, it all became dreadful so quickly. Her voice trembled again. Miss Marple let a moment pass. You did not remain with the search? No. Clara looked away toward the gateposts and the empty lane. I thought of something and came out. What did you think of? Clara's fingers tightened until the knuckles whitened. I thought someone might have persuaded her to go out by the side path. Someone? Yes, Miss Marple said after a pause. Mr. Felix Dane. The reaction was immediate. Clara flushed scarlet, then white. How did you know? My dear, in villages one never knows. One merely compares. There was a girl in St. Mary Mead once who had exactly that expression whenever a commercial traveller named Purvis was mentioned. It was not love exactly, more a mixture of alarm and poor judgment. To Clara's credit, she gave a small, involuntary laugh, though her eyes filled at once afterward. I never cared for him, she said. At least, I never meant. I only thought he understood things. So he had lived in London and talked as if everything in life needn't be so fixed forever. He was kind when Uncle died, and I was left in that wretched uncertainty. But later, she stopped. Later he wanted something. Yes, Miss Marple waited. He wanted me to help him with Mrs. Dalrymple. In what way? Clara bent her head. He thought she meant to alter her will. Many people seem to think that. He said it more certainly than the others. He asked foolish questions at first. Who visited her, whether she saw Mr. Tilling privately, whether she kept old papers in the Japanese cabinet. I told him it was improper and would not discuss it. Then 3 days ago, he became quite different. He said I was being childish and that a woman in my position could not afford scruples. Miss Marple's gentle voice remained unchanged. And today? Clara looked up with sudden misery. He sent me a note this morning, only 2 lines, asking me to meet him by the church gate after the tableau began, because he had something urgent to say about Mrs. Dalrymple. I ought not to have gone. I know I ought not, but I was frightened by then. Frightened of him. Yes, and of what he might do. Miss Marple folded the ribbon inside her glove. You met him? Clara nodded. He said Mrs. Dalrymple had received a letter, one that would change everything, and that if I was wise, I would persuade her not to see Mr. Tilling until tomorrow. I asked what letter. He wouldn't say. Peter came up then, and everything was dreadful and humiliating, and I went back toward the house. But when I reached the morning room, she was gone. And after the alarm, I remembered what Felix had said. I thought perhaps he had induced her to come out this way, perhaps by the little side gate near the yew walk. So I ran here. Then I found the cane. She broke off, breathing fast again. Miss Marple considered. The story had the untidy sound of truth, but not the whole truth. Clara had told enough to be dangerous to herself, which was generally a hopeful sign. Liars, especially frightened ones, preferred cleaner accounts. Did you tell Dr. Fane or Mr. Tilling any of this? No, how could I? Peter would think. My dear, said Miss Marple, Peter Cleeve already thinks a great many unfortunate things, and none of them will be improved by withholding facts. Before Clara could answer, voices came from the direction of the manor gates. Men were hurrying down the lane. Dr. Fane in front, Peter Cleeve beside him, and behind them the gardener, and Mr. Tilling, puffing but determined. Peter saw Clara and quickened his pace. Clara, He reached her in 2 strides. His face, still dark with agitation, altered completely at the sight of her distress. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Where have you been?" "They said—" He stopped, aware of the others. Dr. Fane's eye went at once to the cane in Miss Marple's hand, then to Clara's torn sleeve. "What's happened here?" Miss Marple answered before Clara could speak. Miss Weston came out searching and found this in the grass. She was naturally upset. Peter turned sharply toward the ditch. "Was there any sign?" "No," said Miss Marple. "Nothing else?" Tilling took off his spectacles and polished them anxiously. "This grows more serious every minute. The police have been sent for. Inspector Hewitt is on his way from Much Benham." At the name, Dr. Fane muttered something under his breath that sounded unmedical. Peter was not listening. He was looking at Clara with a concentration almost painful in its intensity. "You should come back," he said. "You oughtn't to be alone." Clara opened her mouth, perhaps to refuse, perhaps to explain, but Miss Marple intervened with the mild decisiveness that so often disconcerted stronger personalities. "Yes," she said, "Miss Weston should certainly come back. And I think, Mr. Cleeve, that you had better stay very close to her. There are moments when a village becomes so excited that it mistakes appearances for facts." Tilling glanced at her, faintly startled. Dr. Fane, however, looked thoughtful. As they turned toward the house, Miss Marple let her eyes travel once more along the verge of the lane. There, near the place where Clara had stood when she cried out, a second trace caught her attention, the impress of a man's shoe in the soft earth by the wall. A large shoe, city-made, with a worn edge to the heel. Not a gardener's boot, not Peter Cleeve's narrow schoolmaster tread. Something altogether neater. She said nothing. At the manor gates the house rose calm and handsome in the lowering gold of late afternoon, every window catching the light. It had the composed, faintly pompous look of a place where servants still spoke of luncheon and drawing-room fires, and where scandal, if it entered, was expected to do so by appointment. Yet the front door stood open. In the hall beyond it there was movement, whispering, suppressed panic. And over all, just like the first chill touch beneath a summer evening, lay the unmistakable feeling that whatever had slipped away from the morning room had not gone far enough. The hall smelled faintly of lavender polish, and something sharper beneath it. Disturbance, Miss Marple thought, had a way of leaving its own particular trace, quite apart from anything material. Cook stood near the foot of the staircase, wringing her hands in a manner that suggested both distress and an underlying resentment at being called upon to display it. 2 maids hovered behind her, whispering and ceasing abruptly whenever anyone looked in their direction. The long case clock ticked with an insistence that seemed almost indecent in the circumstances. "Miss Weston!" cried Cook, advancing at once. "Oh, miss, where have you been? We've been that worried." "I am quite well." "Oh, Cook," Clara said, though her voice trembled. "There is nothing more to be found outside." Cook cast a doubtful glance at Miss Marple, then at Peter Cleeve as though seeking confirmation from a more reliable authority. "Dr. Fane," she said, "you'd better come and see the room again. Mr. Tilling says as how nothing must be touched, but it don't look natural, not left as it is." "Quite right," said Tilling quickly. "Nothing must be disturbed until the inspector arrives." "Inspector or no inspector," Cook returned with spirit, "I'm not having that vase lying smashed where anyone can tread on it and cut themselves." Dr. Fane intervened with the practiced diplomacy of one accustomed to managing both illness and household authority. "Let us all go together," he said. And then we shall decide what is best." Miss Marple followed them into the morning room. It was a gracious apartment, with tall windows opening onto the terrace and a view beyond of lawns descending in orderly dignity to a line of yews. The late afternoon light lay across the carpet in long, golden bars. Everything, at first glance, appeared as it should be, and yet it was as Clara had said. The small, round table near the French window lay on its side, one leg twisted awkwardly beneath it. The vase, a heavy piece of blue glass, had shattered against the hearthrug, leaving a scatter of jagged fragments and a dark stain where water had soaked into the weave. A chair had been pushed back sharply from the writing desk. On the carpet near it lay Clara's handbag, its clasp open, contents half spilled. Miss Marple did not go at once to the window. Instead, she moved quietly about the room, looking not at the obvious disturbance, but at the things that had not been disturbed. The desk, for instance, was neat. Too neat, perhaps. Papers lay in ordered piles, the inkstand precisely aligned. A pen rested across a blotter on which there was no fresh mark. The chair beside it had been moved, certainly, but not recently used for writing. She glanced at Clara. "You had not been working here?" "No," Clara said. "Mrs. Dalrymple does not like me to use the desk when she is present." "Quite so." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the Japanese cabinet in the corner, a handsome piece, lacquered and inlaid, its doors closed. There was no sign that it had been opened. "Mr. Tilling," she said mildly, "you mentioned that Mrs. and Dalrymple might be altering her will." Tilling started. I did not say that precisely." "No," said Miss Marple, "but one often infers such things in a village." Tilling cleared his throat. Mrs. Dalrymple had expressed a wish to review certain papers. Nothing more. And had she done so today? "Not to my knowledge." Miss Marple inclined her head and turned at last to the French window. It stood open by perhaps a foot, the curtains stirring gently in the evening air. Beyond, the terrace lay empty, the stones still warm with the day's heat. There were no marks upon it that could be called footprints, only the faint scuffing one might expect from ordinary passage. Dr. Fane had knelt by the broken vase. "No blood," he said, almost to himself, "and no sign of a struggle beyond the overturned table. If she had fallen, she would scarcely have vanished," Miss Marple observed. He looked up at her, frowning slightly. "No." Peter Cleeve stood near the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides. His eyes moved restlessly from Clara to the window, from the window to the desk, as though each object accused him of ignorance. "Clara," he said suddenly, "are you certain she did not go out willingly?" Clara shook her head. "She would not have left without her hat and her shawl, and she never uses the terrace steps without her cane." Miss Marple, still holding the ivory-handled stick, glanced down at it thoughtfully. "Yet the cane was found outside," she said. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Which suggests," said Miss Marple gently, "that Mrs. Dalrymple did go out, but not perhaps in the manner she would have chosen." A silence fell. It was Tilling who broke it, his voice strained. "Are you implying—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear sir, I imply nothing. I merely observe that people rarely abandon their habits without a reason, and that reason is seldom a comfortable one." At that moment, there came the sound of wheels on the gravel outside, followed by the firm closing of a motor-car door. Cook gave a little gasp. "That'll be the police." Miss Marple moved toward the window, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked out. In the fading light, a figure was crossing the terrace toward the house, a man in plain clothes, compact, purposeful, with the unmistakable air of one accustomed to entering confusion and expecting answers from it. Behind him, at a little distance, Felix Dane stood watching. He was very still, and though his face wore its usual expression of polite composure, there was, just for an instant, something in his posture that suggested not surprise, nor even concern, but calculation interrupted. Inspector Hewitt did not hurry, yet he lost no time. By the time the others had reached the hall, he was already removing his gloves with a neat, economical gesture and casting a brief, comprehensive glance about him, taking in the servants, the strained faces, the open door, the faint disorder that no amount of hurried tidying could quite conceal. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was level, not unkind, but entirely without indulgence. I understand Mrs. Dalrymple is missing." Tilling stepped forward at once. "Yes, Inspector Hewitt. Most extraordinary situation. Vanished from her morning room. No explanation." "I shall hear everything," said Hewitt, "but not all at once, if you please." His eyes moved from Tilling to Dr. Fane, then to Clara Weston, who stood pale and trembling near the staircase. They rested there for a fraction longer than politeness required. "You are Miss Weston?" "Yes." "You were with Mrs. Dalrymple shortly before she disappeared?" "Yes." "I will speak to you presently." He turned then, quite deliberately, to Miss Marple. "And you are?" "Miss Marple," she said. "I am staying with Mrs. Harrow." Hewitt inclined his head slightly. "You were among the first to see the outside path, I believe." "I took a short walk," said Miss Marple. "One sees more, sometimes. And when one is not expected to see anything at all." For the briefest instant, something like amusement flickered in the inspector's eyes. Then it was gone. "Show me the room," he said. They returned together. Hewitt stood just inside the threshold for a moment, doing nothing at all. It was a curious habit, Miss Marple thought, but not an unfamiliar one. She had known another inspector, years ago, who would stand thus and allow the room to speak before he interrupted it with questions. At last he crossed to the overturned table, examined the broken vase, and glanced toward the desk. "No sign of forced entry," he said. "Window open, disturbance localized." He looked at Clara. "You say you were absent how long?" 3 or 4 minutes. "Long enough," he murmured. He moved to the French window and stepped out onto the terrace, and the others followed more slowly. The light had shifted. The gold of afternoon was fading into something cooler, more uncertain. Shadows lay longer now across the lawn. Hewitt crouched near the threshold, studying the stone. "No clear impressions," he said. "Hard surface. But there's scuffing here. 2 sets, I think. One lighter, one heavier." He straightened. "Mrs. Dalrymple was not a strong woman." "No," said Dr. Fane. "Stubborn, but not physically robust." Hewitt nodded and turned. "You found her cane outside?" Miss Marple held it out. "In the grass by the lane." He took it, examined the bent pin of the brooch still caught faintly in the handle's groove, then handed it back. "She did not walk out unaided," he said quietly. Behind them, a voice spoke. "That is a very serious conclusion, Inspector." Felix Dane had come up from the garden and now stood at the edge of the terrace, his manner as composed as ever. "Is it?" said Hewitt without turning. "It seems a practical one." Felix smiled faintly. "Practical, perhaps, but in a village one must be careful of practical conclusions. They have a way of becoming accusations." Hewitt faced him then. "And you are?" "Felix Dane. I'm staying at Dean Lodge." "Yes." Hewitt regarded him steadily. "You were present at the fete." "I was." "And you saw Miss Weston shortly before the alarm was raised." Felix's expression did not alter, but there was the slightest pause before he answered. "Yes." "What did you speak of?" "Nothing of consequence." "Village matters. The fete. Mrs. Dalrymple's expected arrival." Clara made a small involuntary movement, but Miss Marple's hand, light as a feather on her sleeve, restrained her. Hewitt's gaze shifted, taking in that gesture, then returning to Felix. "You did not mention any letter?" he asked. Felix's eyes flickered, only for a moment. "A letter? One that might change everything, perhaps." Silence followed. It was very slight, that hesitation, but it existed. And in such moments, Miss Marple thought, truth often stood just behind the eyes, waiting to see whether it would be called forward or dismissed. Felix laughed softly. "My dear Inspector, if I had such knowledge, I should hardly discuss it on a village green." "No," said Hewitt. "You would choose your moment more carefully." The words fell without emphasis, yet they carried weight. Felix's smile remained, but it had lost something. Warmth, perhaps, or ease. "I think," he said, "as you are reading too much into an ordinary conversation." "Possibly," said Hewitt. He turned away, as though the matter were of no further importance. But Miss Marple, watching both men, thought otherwise. Because Felix Dane had recovered too quickly, and Inspector Hewitt, she suspected, had noticed it too. The discovery at the pond altered everything, and yet, Miss Marple reflected later, not quite in the way most people expected. For while Inspector Hewitt at once took command with brisk authority, sending for lanterns, ordering the body to be drawn carefully from the water, and dispatching a constable to secure the grounds, the essential facts did not, in themselves, solve the mystery. They merely sharpened it. Mrs. Dalrymple was dead. That was now beyond doubt. But how she had come from the morning room to the pond, and in whose company, remained the question upon which everything depended. They gathered again somewhat later in the drawing-room, those whom the inspector deemed necessary. The lamps were lit. The cheerful disorder of the fete seemed impossibly distant. Faces were pale, strained, altered by the knowledge of death. Clara Weston sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Peter Cleeve remained near her, his earlier agitation subdued now into something protective and grim. Dr. Fane stood by the mantel, his expression thoughtful but troubled. Mr. Tilling had taken a chair and seemed to wish himself anywhere else. Felix Dane stood apart. He was composed, admirably so. Only Miss Marple, watching him, thought that composure had become just a shade too deliberate, as though it were being maintained rather than simply existing. No, Inspector Hewitt spoke briefly. "Mrs. Dalrymple was found in the pond. There are no immediate signs of violent injury beyond what might be accounted for by a fall. That does not, however, suggest accident. The circumstances within the house make that highly unlikely." He paused. "We must therefore consider how she came to be there and with whom." He turned to Clara. "You have already given your account. I will ask you only one further question. When you returned to the morning room and found it empty, did you notice anything missing besides Mrs. Dalrymple herself?" Clara hesitated. My handbag was on the floor. Everything else seemed as it should be." "No papers disturbed?" "No." Hewitt nodded. "Mr. Dane," he said, "you spoke to Miss Weston shortly before the disappearance. You denied mentioning any letter. Do you still maintain that?" Felix smiled faintly. "I do." Miss Marple spoke then, very gently. "My dear Mr. Dane, it is always such a pity when one is obliged to maintain something that is not quite true. It becomes so very tiring." Every head turned toward her. Felix's smile did not falter. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "No," said Miss Marple, "but you will." She folded her hands. "It is curious, is it not, how often one sees the same little pattern repeated? There was a young man in St. Mary Mead once, most agreeable, very well dressed, who discovered that an elderly lady intended to alter her will. He could not know precisely how, of course, but he was quite certain it would not be to his advantage. So he contrived to place himself near the situation, very helpful, very attentive, and waited for his opportunity." Felix's eyes rested on her now, more intently. Miss Marple continued as though speaking only to herself. He persuaded a younger person, someone rather anxious and uncertain, to assist him, though not in anything very definite. Only to observe, to report, to delay matters slightly. It seemed harmless enough at first, but such arrangements rarely remain harmless. Clara made a small sound. Peter's hand tightened on the back of her chair. "And then," Miss Marple went on, "something occurred which he had not quite planned. The older lady, perhaps, became suspicious, or she received a letter, something that made her determined to act at once, not tomorrow. That would be most inconvenient, would it not?" She looked up, especially if one had already told someone that everything depended upon delay. The silence in the room deepened. Felix said quietly, "You are speculating." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but one must begin somewhere. Now, what happens next?" "He goes to the house. He persuades the lady to speak with him, perhaps on the terrace, perhaps only for a moment. She is not a weak woman, but she is accustomed to being obeyed, not resisted. There is a struggle, not a long one, as the room suggests. The table is overturned, the vase falls. The brooch is torn loose." Dr. Fane shifted slightly. "The pin was bent back." "Yes." Miss Marple nodded. "She is taken outside, not carried very far. She was not a light woman, but supported perhaps. The cane is taken with her because she would insist upon it, or because it was already in her hand." Hewitt said quietly, "And the pond?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The pond." She looked at Felix. "It is very near, very convenient, and in such moments convenience often masquerades as opportunity." Felix's composure held, but only just. "You have no proof," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear sir, proof is so often a matter of small things. For instance, the mark on the carpet, suggesting she was not dragged far. The tear in the curtain where she caught at it. The footprint by the lane, quite neat, quite urban. And then," she paused, "the ribbon." Hewitt glanced at her sharply. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "A piece of blue ribbon, torn with a small stain. Not from Miss Weston's dress, as it happens, but from a hat trimming I observed earlier on Mrs. Dalrymple herself. It must have come loose during the struggle and been carried out. That it was found on the path leading to the lane, not toward the terrace steps, but toward the sideway." Felix's gaze flickered. "And finally," Miss Marple said, "there is the matter of timing. You spoke to Miss Weston. You knew she would be away from the house for a few minutes. You knew Mrs. Dalrymple would be alone." Hewitt stepped forward slightly. "And you were seen near the terrace shortly after," he added. Felix was silent now. Miss Marple's voice remained as mild as ever. "You did not mean to kill her, I think. Such things are rarely planned so far in advance. But when she resisted, when she threatened, perhaps, to expose your interest in her affairs, you acted quickly. And afterward you relied on confusion, on the village, on the assumption that no one would see clearly until it was too late." Felix drew a breath. For a moment, till it seemed he might speak, deny, deflect, charm his way free. Then something in his expression altered. The calculation returned, but this time without disguise. "You are very clever," he said quietly. "But cleverness is not evidence." "No," said Hewitt, "but it leads us to it." He moved forward. "And I think we shall find what we require, in your rooms, in your correspondence. Perhaps even in that letter you were so anxious to suppress." Felix did not move as the constable stepped up behind him. For a moment longer he stood perfectly still. Then, very slightly, he inclined his head. Miss Marple watched him go. Later, when the house had quieted and the first statements had been taken, she sat once more with her knitting, though she did not, for some time, make a single stitch. Mrs. Harrow, pale but recovering, said, "My dear Miss Marple, how did you know? It all seems so dreadful." Miss Marple sighed softly. "It is seldom really surprising," she said. "People are very much alike, you know. Vanity, fear, the desire for advantage, these things do not change. Only the setting does. And poor Mrs. Dalrymple." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Poor Mrs. Dalrymple. She was not a particularly kind woman, I think, but she did not deserve that." Outside, the village lay unusually still. The faint bunting stirred faintly in the night air, its bright colors now indistinguishable in the dark. "Will things go back to normal?" Mrs. Harrow asked. Miss Marple looked toward the window. "Oh, yes," she said gently. "They always do." She paused, then added, "But one never quite forgets the shadow that slipped away."